We're kind of sitting there in the background.
Okay.
But we're just going to do this by the seat of our pants.
Works for me.
Fantastic. So, hello to everyone. I am going to take this banner down. Or Chris, can you take the banner down, please? We're live right now on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on YouTube. Fantastic. And I love this. I love this, flying without net. What do they say? Live on a wire, no net or anything like that. Broadcasting live. I'm here with David Kelly, who is the CEO of the Learning Guild. And it's going to be a really interesting conversation because we're going to talk about trends in e-learning today. Before we get started, though, I want to remind everybody, my name is Ladek. I work for a company called OpenLMS, and you are watching the eLearn Hotseat, or sometimes we call it the eLearn podcast because we've combined both of those. We have a whole lot of cool things that we have put out there on the podcast, but also, we put on this event every year called the eLearn Success Summit or the eLearn Success Series. And the Success Series this year has 4 events to it. And our first event is coming up in just 1 week, which is called the Design Session. And I encourage everybody to go over and check out elearnsuccessseries.com to go get a free ticket and check that out. People like David, unfortunately, you won't be a speaker this year at that particular session, although we had talked about you being at the EdTech session or the innovation session. So that may happen. I don't know. Maybe I've just publicly called you out and said that you need to come be a speaker there. We'll see. We'll see.
That just definitely just happened.
All right. Awesome. Yeah. We'll see if we can get on your calendar. But David, for those people who don't know, which kind of, for people who listen to this type of thing, what is the Learning Guild and who are you? Can you give us the 60 seconds on that?
Sure. Learning Guild is a professional development community for people who work in the space at the intersection of learning and technology. We've been around for over 20 years. We do a host of different types of publications and resources for people to learn and develop skills around, from Learning Solutions magazine to monthly research and publications. A lot of people also associate us with our major conferences and events that we host. We host Learning Solutions, which will take place in Orlando in April. Learning 2022, which is also in Orlando later in the year in November. And our flagship event is the DevLearn Conference and Expo, which takes place in October in Las Vegas.
How many professionals are in the Learning Guild? Do you have are you allowed to put out a broad number?
Yeah, we've got last time I checked, it was about 68,000 members that are active in the guild.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And when you have a community like that, is it an overwhelming amount of noise that comes in, or do people sort of self-organize themselves fairly well and follow, kind of, I know we're going to talk about trends, but do they follow trends? Do they follow threads? Do they put themselves in groups, or is that like a really massive organizing effort?
No, we don't force the social components. We allow the social to take place where people naturally are anyway. So we have presences on all the major social media channels so they can connect with each other there. We don't necessarily force the conversation, so to speak. We provide resources and spaces where the conversations can naturally take place on their own. So whether it be in an event or whether we're providing publications and different types of media that people can converse around, we provide the resources and try to create the environment where it can naturally take place and allow it to just organically grow from there.
So that said, I actually, before I jump again, one more question before I jump into the trends conversation. How did you stumble into this space? I mean, was this always your intention? This is where you were going. This, you've been doing this, you said, for more than 20 years. I've just noticed that, we've talked to so many people on this podcast, on this hot seat, and there always seems to be a common conversation of, didn't expect to get here. This is where I was like, what was your trajectory?
So I have 2 layers of the not expected to be here. One is probably the similar to the story that you've heard from other people, which is I spent the first 10 plus years of my career in banking. And I was really, really good at my job. So they looked at me and said, "You're good at your job. Go show other people how to do that."
Mm.
And I started training people on how to do that. I was luckily, just based on the environment, I worked for a bank that went through a number of acquisitions, acquired a lot of other banks. So there was probably a 3 or 4 year period that it was like, go show other people how to do this. We acquired somebody. There's this new group of people. Go show them how to do this. So without ever formally changing my role, I was a district manager or something at that point. I wound up spending a good solid 18 months or 2 years training people,
Mm.
and discovered that I loved it, discovered that the organization saw I was doing different things, and I made the pivot to becoming a learning and a trainer for the bank, and became the training director of that bank. And midway through that transition, I kind of stopped saying I'm a banker and started saying I'm a trainer, because I started really enjoying. I discovered I love this space. And I did that for a couple of different banks and nonprofits that I worked for a while, where I was a training director in different spaces, and was very active in the learning industry community on social media and such. I put myself out there. I tried to speak at events. And then while I was working at the nonprofit, which is a job that I still loved, the guild called and said, "We love what you're doing. We love what you're sharing. Would you like to come and do it over here?" And I said no, because I was very happy working for the nonprofit. And then the conversations just kept popping up of we'd like you to, we think there's some opportunities here, and it was a very different shift. It was kind of, I at the time I looked at it from through the lens of, I don't know if I want to become someone who's doing this thing to someone who's talking about doing this thing. But then I started learning more about the role, and saw the opportunities to really help the industry in a different way, because I'm very passionate about the industry, and decided to make the jump, and I'm extremely happy that I did. Started with the guild, just kind of managing the conference events, and have, in the time that I've been here, almost 10 years, have just kind of expanded the role and the support that I could give to the organization as a whole, to the point that I'm at now.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. I really appreciate putting that story on the table. I love the transition from, I'm no longer a banker. I do training. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
68,000 people. So you are a person who definitely has your ear to the ground on what's happening in the online learning, e-learning, distance learning, learning space in general.
Mhm.
What's like the first thing that comes, is top of mind, or the first thing that you're talking about as Learning Guild here in 2022 as this is the trend that you need to follow, or this is the trend that we see that's going to come up and bite everybody?
It's interesting. You phrased it two different ways, and I feel like there might be two different answers.
Sorry.
That's okay. So great. That makes a good question. Fun question. So the first part of it is like, what are the trends that everybody's talking about? I think adding 2022 to that question, people are less focused. While there are learning trends, and I'm sure we'll touch on a lot of them, I think people are a little less focused on the learning trends and more on the workplace trends. We're entering this period of everybody was remote. Now we're talking about people coming back to the office. Is it going to be hybrid? Is it going to be this? And I think the biggest trend right now that people are focused on is, what's my organization's future going to look like, and how does my L&D strategy need to pivot to accommodate that? How do we need to shuffle our deck and change our strategies to address the fact that we may be a mix of people who are in person and remote. We may be going back to all in person. How do we pivot accordingly so that we're providing the most appropriate level of support to the workers and the environments that they're in? I think that is top of mind for the vast majority of people, and will probably continue to be top of mind for at least definitely months ahead for all of 2022, potentially longer, depending on, every organization's got the different maturity in terms of when they're comfortable going back to whatever that new normal looks like for them.
Mm-hmm. What is there an answer there though? I guess it's a question. It seems like the hybrid, or it comes down to sort of that individual company or workplace, or as you said, nonprofit or whatever, government choice. So there is an answer. How does a learning professional, either a designer or instructor or trainer or whatever, how do you counsel them to prepare themselves for this? Is it just, look, get really flexible and be agile, or is it, here are, here are 2 or 3 strategies that you can definitely use to, for whatever situation you're going to find yourself in?
Good. It's a great question. So a couple of different answers to it. The first thing is, and you kind of touched on, I think, what is the most important answer in the way you phrased the question. There is no right answer to that question. There's no, this is what you should be doing. There is not the best, there's not the right answer. There's the right answer for you and for your organization. And that you have to bring the context of your own environment in and bring that in and then apply it appropriately. So to another aspect of what you asked there, are there proven practices? And I don't like to use the phrase best practice because it implies that it's the best no matter where you go. I did this, it worked. It's a proven practice that is replicable, but you might need to adapt it for it to work in your environment. So it's not necessarily a best practice that you can take what I did and apply it, but it's a proven practice that worked for me that you can apply it as need be, but you might need to adapt it to your own context. And I think that there are some proven practices emerging from the last year and a half around things that people have done to support people that are remote in an effective way. The other piece of it that I will say is I try to always throw a soapbox disclaimer of like, this is kind of my own opinion more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And this will be one of those moments. I don't believe anyone has cracked the hybrid nut yet. I think that we're still figuring out what hybrid means. And the vast majority of hybrid implementations that I've seen so far, it's not 1 plus, in-person plus virtual, 1 + 1 = 3. It's 1 + 1 = like 1.25 or 1.5, because ultimately, and we've been implementing this in our own work. Ultimately, you see what I'm finding is that somebody in that equation, whether it be the people that are in person or the people that are remote, are getting a lesser experience. They're getting a watered down experience. I see it with as great as a job as my kids' schools are doing. When they're remote, I see it as they're watching the in-person experience, which is very different than a virtual first experience. It's one of the reasons that we've made a conscious decision with our events that we're not doing a hybrid event. And it's not that we don't want to accommodate people or bring more people to participate. It's just that if you're coming to our face-to-face event, we are going to focus on delivering the best face-to-face experience. We're going to devote 100% of our attention towards creating that experience for you. We'll do a separate virtual event and give 100% of our attention to that so that we can create a digital first experience for you there. There are a lot of events that are doing hybrid, and it's not what we think is. We don't feel like that's going to work for us, because it does feel. Again, I don't want I'm calling on any different events or anything. I've been to a number of events that are hybrid, and it's either you're an in-person thing watching something virtual and thinking, I didn't need to be here. I could have done this from my desk.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're doing something at an in-person conference and you're watching in, and you are definitively just like voyeuristically watching a session. Which is better, admittedly, is better than not having the option at all. I don't take away from that at all. But it is a lesser experience. So I don't think there's a lot of energy going on in the industry around finding ways to build new hybrid events. There's all sorts of platforms that have emerged in the last 2 years. I think eventually someone will crack that nut on delivering a hybrid experience where it enhances everyone's experience, not just giving access, but makes the experience better. But I think we're a ways off from that.
Take me down that rabbit hole just a little further, because my initial reaction is I agree with you that if you're going to choose to walk the middle ground and say, look, this event or this session or whatever it is going to be hybrid, then you're going to have to make choices about what's possible, and that's going to create a lesser experience for someone else. Where does that go when we go down a little further into the education specific or workplace piece? And I'm going to lead the witness a little bit here, in that it just so happens we're talking here February 16th. My kid stayed home from school today, right? Didn't feel so good, so we're like, hey, look, why don't you stay home? He was able to seamlessly connect with and participate, or he still is participating in the coursework for today. He's interacting with his classmates. He's essentially there but not there, right? Yeah. And I think that happens for a lot of workspaces. And I'm also watching the design of an office.
It's so
Again,
true.
my wife works for a large organization. They're moving their offices. They're designing their office, and they're purposefully not even creating enough space or not renting enough space for all of their staff because they know that there's going to be this play
Mhm.
of not people there. So talk to me about what you see there. Is that a lesser experience? Is that, to me, it's like, are we just that we need to get comfortable with that? And where does that fit in building skills or being prepared as a learning professional?
Sure. So I think that the world of work is evolving. There's no question of that. The story that what you just shared, the painting you just painted there, is reflective of that. So it's not a question of we can and cannot do this. It's going to evolve, and I think for a lot of organizations, they're not going to come back to the office full time. We're not going to go back to the way things were. There's going to be a new normal, and we have to figure out a way to accommodate that new normal. And the piece that I always the term that I always come back to on that is how can we do that with equity? And I don't mean that in a traditional DEI standpoint, although that is extremely important. I mean that specifically in the context of equity in terms of the technology and the experience that people are having. Even last week, I was we had one of our first in-person gatherings of our team. And we had a couple of the members of the team that were comfortable coming back to the office and doing that, a couple of members who were remote. And despite all of the best efforts, and part of this is just a shifting of natural human behavior beyond even the skills we have as L&D professionals. Despite our best efforts and specifically facilitating activities that were joint and using different types of collaborative technologies that leveled the playing field as much as we can, you still felt like the people who were up on the screen in a Zoom weren't getting the same level of attention and from my standpoint as the person who was leading, I mean, what's concerning to me was I noticed that their level of input in the meeting
Mm.
was less than the people who were physically present at the table. And I think part of that is how we're structuring things. I think we bridged using that meeting as an example. I think we did a good job of bridging that gap by using technologies like Google Docs and Miro boards that leveled the playing field to everybody because we were all doing the same sort of thing. But there were some things in just the terms of the natural human behavior that left some people out. We had to make a conscious thought of what do you think? What do you think? To bring them back into the discussion, to feel like they were present in the discussion. And I think that part of that is just a natural shifting of how we do work, and part of that is leveraging our skills as L&D professionals to recognize where those gaps are and to find new ways to bring everybody on the same page. One of the examples that I gave somebody the other day was how to do this in a virtual environment. How to do this in an in-person environment. Make a list of all the different things that you do to engage people and just think of it as a Venn diagram. What's the space in the middle that if I do this, it works in a virtual environment, it works in an in-person environment, and focus there, because then you're putting everybody kind of in the same place. But I do think as we continue to evolve, the question of equity in terms of how do I make sure that everyone is getting a similar level of experience? How do I make sure that the opportunities, not just in learning, but in terms of just any sort of thing that presents itself as an opportunity, not to go too far outside of the scope of L&D, but the relationship that you generally can form with a boss just in the hallway conversations that can ultimately lead to your ability to move forward in your career. That's a significant advantage that you have if you don't have those opportunities because you're remote. And
Mhm.
how are we bridging those gaps? How is that going to shift the future of work? I think that's a little bit more of an HR leaning discussion, but L&D has a role to play. But I think coming back to your question, I think as we continue to evolve what the world of work looks like, we always need to be asking ourselves the question of, is there equity in terms of between the people who are remote and the people who are in person, and how do we get that as close as possible so that they all have the same opportunities?
Mm. What about tech equity? Digital divide equity, especially that, like, if we take it down to the education level. Have you been listening, or have you been hearing conversations within the community about, hey, look, access is a real thing for my students. It's a real thing for my workers, and we need to give them all mobile devices, or we need to give them all Chromebooks or something like that. And maybe this is changing budget allocations or those kinds of conversations. Are those types of things that are happening?
Absolutely. You're seeing it more I think that's more of a conversation in the education space, especially in the K-12 space, because I mean, I'll use my own example. When all this went down in March of 2020, um, I give the schools that my kids are part of a lot of credit because they were closed for 2 days and they came back and it was like you were describing earlier of just they went online and things were normal. But both of the schools that my kids go to, both of them have iPads. Like
Mhm.
every student, when you go into, they're in middle school and high school, and when you go into the school, you get an iPad. So there was that foundational element of everybody's on the same page. And man, I felt so bad for the schools that didn't have that advantage, that they were unfortunate to have that, because how do you address that? And even as the challenges of even though my kid's school had that advantage, I have two kids, and we made it work. But I know families that have five kids, and all of them were remote, and the parents are remote working, and there's only a certain amount of bandwidth that's coming through that pipe if everybody's through Zoom. Um, and even that is a piece of the equity. I think on a corporate level, it's easier to figure that out because you're in a position to level the playing field, assuming you have the budget to say, we're going to get everybody a Chromebook, we're going to get everybody an iPad, so that everybody's on the same page from a technology standpoint as they're going out. Budgetary constraints, of course, might apply there, but you're in more of a position than a school district funded by tax dollars to do that, and dealing with all the parents in their own individual environments that they're in. So I think that leveling of a playing field is a big challenge that everybody's got to look at it in their organization and say, well, what resources do we have? How can we level the playing field as much as we can for everybody within the resources constraints that we're dealing with?
Nice. I want to pivot kind of backwards for a second, because we started with your big topic, or the thing for 2022 that we talked about was what's hybrid mean. How do we define that and those sorts of things. Like I want to see if we could look inward a little bit. Like, what do you see impacting the learning and development, the learning professional sector right now? What are the trends that are impacting those individuals who are instructional designers, who are trainers, who are LMS administrators? What are those pieces that that you see them talking about, or you're creating materials for to be a resource?
Sure. So I'll answer two ways to that. One is there's near term, and then there's long term. I think the near term is all about the hybrid. It's all about the resources of people who have either needed to pivot towards virtual instruction or need to enhance their ability to do virtual instruction. I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting for our field in general is how much of a spotlight the world has placed on what I would broadly throw the label of online training or online learning out there. Everybody's now doing online learning, although everyone defines that in a different way. So I think there's a lot of attention in the near term of either how do I do this? We've only done in-person training. How do we do this virtual thing? Or even the people who've been doing it for years, there's more attention placed on it. And how do I do this better? How do I do this more effectively? I'll use my kids' examples. When I think it was around September or maybe August of 2020, after the school year was over, before the new school year started for my kids, the schools sent a survey and said, how did we do, essentially, and ask a bunch of questions on, we're planning for the fall. We know that this is still going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with. How did we do? And for every question that they asked, they said, it depends on when you're asking me this question. And then the last one that they asked, I said, it depends on when you're asking me this question. And if you're wondering why I keep saying that, give me a call. And I'm familiar with like the principle and such. So I know, like, it wasn't as probably as sarcastic as it sounded. Once they saw my name, they were kind of like, oh, well, let's give Mr. Kelly a call. Because anyway, and they did, to their credit, they gave me a call. And they said, well, all right, so why do you keep saying it depends on your asking? I said, because if you're asking me these questions in April, where the yardstick was based on did school happen today, I'm giving you flying colors. You did an amazing job because you were blindsided by all of this, like we all were. But nobody has a right to be blindsided come September. We all knew the environment. We had time to prepare. So if you're doing the same thing you did in April, in September, I'm going to grade you a lot lower because you had time to prepare. And I think that that's very much the environment that we're all in. Like, we're not. It's not just okay. Did training happen today? Did school happen today? Was it effective? And I think that's for even the people who were in the virtual instruction before. There's more accountability towards how do I do this right? Because everybody's online now. like just being online is not a success metric anymore. How do we do this right? How do we make sure if we're going to have to lean into this space more often, how do we make sure we're doing it effectively? How do we make sure we're generating the performance objectives that we want to? And I think that there's a rising ship of everybody trying to do it better that is just going to make what we do with virtual instruction as an industry more effective. And that's kind of an exciting place to be.
Mm. Has that rising ship, have you seen a fallout in in two ways? Like, either people who've been in the instructors for a long time, professors, teachers, whatever, who said, look, this is I signed up for something totally different. I'm checking out. I'm not going to reskill. I'm not going to retrain. And then other people coming in for that, or like one of the things that I've been tracking personally is the rise of the instructional designer, from the PowerPoint, a few years ago, to this is the project manager. This is a critical component of most teams now, either in corporate or the higher ed space. Any insights there?
Yeah, so I agree with many of the insights you shared. I think there's a small isolated people in the corporate and organizational learning that have gone through this and be like, I'm out. And I think that those are people who have been classroom trainers for 30 years, who are probably near retirement anyway, and just, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this new thing. It's not my space. It's not what I enjoy. I don't want to do it. And I think those are more outliers than anything else. Most of the people that are already in L&D roles have embraced the challenge of needing to do things in a different way. Where I do see a shift is on the educational side. I do think that there are teachers who, I can't imagine the pressure that it's for the teachers to have to deal with all of the challenges that they've had with the limited resources that they're also often dealing with, to have to educate our kids. And you do see an influx of teachers who are saying, I'm going to leave academia and I'm going to go into the corporate world and become an instructional designer. There are a lot of resources that are out there you can always tell when there's energy moving in a certain direction because people start selling to that space. And there are a lot of resources that are emerging around how do you make the pivot from academia to L&D, become an instructional designer. There are a lot of people who are exploring that shift in their role, which is something that we've actually looked at how we can support as well, because we're finding a lot of people coming to us as a community looking for resources on how do I pivot my career from an academic environment to more of a corporate role in instructional design. I think that there's going to be a lot of people making that shift in the coming years.
Have you also seen like a rebrand in terms of company focus, or maybe like I'm really fishing here, but a database company that is, hey, now we're an e-learning company, or hey, a company that used to make widgets but now that's pivoting. I mean those are pretty extreme examples, but have you started to see that kind of rebrand, resell, so that people are tapping into what's happened over the last 20 months?
On the supplier side, you mean?
Yeah, just sort of in the tech side, on the supplier side, on the those things.
Oh, yes, everyone is. I think a lot of the suppliers some of them have just naturally grown because their space played into virtual anyway. So I can't do the in-person anymore. I got to find someone to help us with the virtual. Oh, you're doing that anyway. Great. Others are just leaning a little bit more into that space. A good example of what I've it's just one example, but I think it's representative of how a lot of the suppliers are looking at it. I'll use my experiences in general. We always have a conference app for when we hold an in-person conference. And you would go out and you would find somebody who offered a conference app. The vast majority of those companies now, over the last 2 years, you can go in and use the same software to create your conference app, but the same thing you're doing right now will enable a virtual platform where instead of it just being something that's built with a full face-to-face environment in mind, and it still works in that environment. Now it also, behind the scenes, is using the same information you plug in, is using it to create the infrastructure that can support an online event. And I think a lot of suppliers are going through that iteration of how do we make sure that we're not losing any customers as part of this transition. Our focus was always on this, it might have been on this narrow slice of the pie, but now the pie is changing. We want to make sure that our business can grow within that. So how do we need to pivot accordingly? And I think understandably so, most of the suppliers are looking at their business through that lens. A lot of them have done a great job of pivoting already.
Mm. I've spent the last 30 minutes asking a lot of questions about where I think trends are going and whatnot. I'd love to know, as someone who sits at the top, the CEO of the Learning Guild,
Mhm.
what are you interested in? Like what excites you? What are you paying attention to? Are there disruptive events or even just sort of side project that you're like, wow, I think this is a really cool trend, and I just want to pay attention to it.
Sure, and thank you for the positioning of that, because there's definitely um, so this is my own personal bias, my own personal interest.
Yeah, sure.
Because while I do think that these things are influential to the industry, um, some of them are just my own passion projects. Some of them are, I think that they are really powerful changes in a certain context. So, as some of the examples, the one that is just kind of like I find it cool. Like I am definitely. I should preface all this by saying I am a shiny object guy. I am. If there's something new, something different, I want to go get it and play with it. And that is definitively me to a T. It's why every time a box comes outside and my wife's like, "What did you buy now?" I'm like, "Honey, it's research. It's for work. I have to do it for research." Um, I'm a shiny object guy. I'm a big fan of VR. I enjoy VR, but I also do think, taking my own personal bias aside, that VR is something to track, because it is something that it enables us to solve a problem that we've never been able to solve before. It's a narrow use case for how where it's very powerful, but it's a use case that we really couldn't solve in any other way. I mean, one of the most prototypical examples of um, of what I mean there is firefighting. You see a lot of firefighting VR applications there. Why? Because the risk of failing in a practical environment is literally life and death. How can we give people the training of what it means to be a firefighter and help them build those skills in a safer environment? And the resources necessary to do that, create that sort of a simulation in VR, are worth it when you consider the alternative of someone failing in that environment to life and death. That's why you see some of that. So I think that there's a very powerful use case of VR to give people the opportunity to practice and build skills in a safe environment where they are unable to do it today. And it gives me the opportunity to play with shiny objects. So there's that one. The other one, and this is less a tool for L&D, but more a knowledge that L&D needs to have. And it's because people are always say, well, where's the AI applications to me? Like, where are all the artificial intelligence applications? They're there. You just don't see it as an artificial. It's under the hood, and it's doing things, but it's not a tool that you implement. It's the tool that's solving the problems that you need, and it's almost invisible to you. And I think L&D professionals need to understand that. There's a level of skill that I often refer to it as conversational competence. My mother would describe it as knowing enough to be dangerous. But it's this idea of, I think that the vast majority of L&D people are going to be applying artificial intelligence in their work in a practical way anytime soon? No. Do I think that artificial intelligence is going to change the world of work and the work that we do as L&D professionals? Yes. And we have to have enough understanding of what the conversation around AI is and how it's transforming the world of work, so that when our IT group is talking about it, we can participate in that conversation. You don't want to you get the knock on the door from your IT department, have them say, listen, we're going to be plugging in a new system that's driven by artificial intelligence. You're going to plug into our HRIS system and our LMS system, and it's going to pull in all your learning data. And we're going to have a project that's going to start 20 minutes to kick us off. And you say, not a problem, I'll be right there. I just want to Google everything that you just said. you want to have at least enough knowledge of what's going on within the industry, so that when that conversation is presented to you, even if you're not going to be proactively putting it on the table, when it's put on the table in front of you, you're ready to participate in that conversation.
I can hear, in the back of my mind, many people who are listening to this podcast or who will listen to this, that big gulp or that big, intake of breath, because they're like, oh, No, what and so I'd like to maybe assuage some of that. Is there a resource? Is there a book? Is there a thing that you would say, point people to in terms of AI, just in terms of AI and learning, maybe, or what AI is that has helped you to get a grasp of it, to have an understanding of it? Or is it really is, hey, do the Google search before this catches you, before you actually have to start digging in that way?
It's a great question. So there's not a single book that I would recommend, although the fact that I don't have that means I should go find one. But what I will describe what I do, and this applies very much to AI, but it applies broadly to emerging technologies. You know, and I say this as the person who is working for the Learning Guild, hosts a number of conferences each year. This is what we do. The most important event that I follow every single year is not one of our events. It's not any event in the L&D industry. It's the Consumer Electronics Show that goes on in Las Vegas every year. And the reason for
Nice.
and the reason for that is because that's where you start to see the trends around how we exist in an increasingly digital world. It's where you start to see how things like AI are changing the way that we interact with each other, with technologies, with devices. You start to see how human behavior around digital means is shifting. And that's going to set expectations around how we interact with each other through technology that informs the work that we do at L&D. It may not, you may look at something like even something as simple as like the Nest applications from Google or Amazon Alexa,
Mhm.
and see them and say, well, there's no way that I can use that in the context of my environment today. That doesn't apply to me. But it does in the context of recognizing that we're starting to, like, even as an example, we're starting to interact with technology by talking to it.
Mhm.
What does that mean? How does that mean? What does that imply to the work that we do? And if you think about an Amazon Alexa as an example, there's a huge amount of artificial intelligence going on under the hood. When you ask it, it has to figure out how to respond. It's tremendous amounts of technology there, but you're not actively implementing. But eventually, we're going to start seeing more voice activated computing in our normal everyday lives, and L&D professionals are going to need to support that. So by cluing into what's going on in just consumer behavior, you're kind of starting to develop some foundational knowledge around how our behaviors are shifting, what that can mean for L&D. Like every single time I look at CES, I always look at an article and ask myself the question, what does this mean to me in the work that I do? And it could be nothing today, but by asking myself that question and going through the process of answering it, I'm starting to build the context of how does AI apply to the work that I do? How does the robotics industry apply to the work that I do? How does the Internet of Things apply to the work that I do? And it starts giving you context to some of the stuff that maybe isn't tactical for you today, and maybe it's not practical, but it starts becoming meaningful because you start building that context around.
Fantastic. So then to me, the obvious next question is, I'm looking at CES, I'm looking at, the next DevLearn, whatever. How do I tell the difference between the Alexa app and the Segway? Which one is a fad that's not going anywhere?
Yep.
Or, will become a very, very small subset niche thing for itself. And the other one that could fundamentally change the way that we work, the way that we learn, and those kinds of things. Is there a process or a flag or a marker that you've seen as you've watched trends over the years that say, yeah, here's how we can know what's going to gel and actually go off?
Sure. So there's two. I'll give you two answers to that. One is broadly, because I do need to follow the broad trends to kind of from a business standpoint. It's in my interest to say, hey, this is going to get some traction. We should allocate some space for it at DevLearn this year. So there is a vested interest in me to kind of be able to tell that difference between, is it going to be a fad or is it going to be something that's going to stick around? And for me, that gauge is, are we hearing just about stories of what it is and how it works and where it and what that are more thought leadership type things of what is this, what is the potential of it? Or are we starting to hear the stories of, this is how I used it, this is the problem that I solved? Are we hearing case studies or just how to use it? Because if you're not hearing real applications of people putting this into practice, then it hasn't tipped yet. And that to me is a huge aspect of who's using it and what problems that it solves. I always recommend, that's a question I always recommend when people say, what sort of questions that I could ask a vendor about a new technology. Ask them to speak to a client. Ask them to share stories that of someone who used this and solved a problem they weren't able to solve otherwise.
Mm.
Which brings me to the main other thing. I think for the average practitioner, for the average organization, it doesn't really matter if broadly it's going to be a hit or it's not. It could be a complete fad, but if it can solve a problem and be effective in your organization, and the technology is scalable, doesn't matter that it doesn't matter to everybody else. It matters because it just solves a problem for you. And people I go back to those questions. What questions should I ask when I'm vetting a new technology? How do I know? And people are always surprised, or often surprised, that the answer that I give isn't really complex. It's a pretty simple question. What problem is it solving that you can't solve today? And if you can't solve that, if you can't answer that question, then why would you spend the money? Because if you can do it anyway, and it's not going to be substantially better or change the user experience, why would you spend the money? I go back to VR as the example. There are a lot of applications in VR that I don't get. I remember one of the first applications that I went to. This is years ago, and I'm not going to call it out directly, but I'll give some context around it. That it was playing in my sweet spot. It was VR, which I've established I'm interested in. It was Neil deGrasse Tyson. I like his work. Talking about space, and it was just like it was a VR application from Neil deGrasse Tyson about space. So I was like, wow, it's like a trifecta. I'm going to go check that out. Put the headset on, gave me a little introduction, and I found myself in a big conference room. And it said, choose your seat. And it was like this big auditorium. And I chose a seat, and I was like, okay. And then it said, all right, start the experience. And then Neil deGrasse Tyson walked out in front of the stage, and there was a big presentation, and he talked to me.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, no, that's not what this, like, I could have done that somewhere else.
Yeah,
I DevLearn years ago. Like, what
we should be on Jupiter together, darn it.
Yes, like what are the unique affordances of this device, and why are you ignoring all of them? And that to me is when people start asking, like, is it going to be a fad or not? What problem is it going to solve? How are you going to use this device to enable new things, or at the bare minimum, do the things you're doing today in a more effective way? And that's the lens that I think everybody needs to be looking at in emerging technology, and don't trust the hype. Don't follow the hype curve. It's one of the reasons I often say I hate buzzwords. Not that I'm vested in buzzwords. We follow the buzzwords. We host conversations around the buzzwords. But I personally hate buzzwords because of how I define them. And I define a buzzword as a term whose usage is spreading faster than its understanding. And that's a dangerous thing, because the value of something that's emerging can get voided out in the hype around it, that people are overpromising. It could be a perfectly valid thing that's going to be delivered, but it gets muddied in all of the hype, and the true value proposition gets lost because it was overpromised in some way. So long answer to your question, and obviously I got touches on a little bit of passion project for me. So.
No, I love it. Well, the last question I ask everybody on one of these conversations, you've kind of foreshadowed, and I'm interested to see if there's a part C to the question, but it's, what are you excited about? And as you look forward 6 months, 12 months, near term future, as a shiny object guy, as someone who's established that you're VR, you're going to go out and get your MetaQuest sometime soon. Is there anything else that you're super excited? Oh, no. Snap! Good job. Is there anything else that you're just like, wow, this is powerful, I'm really excited about it, and maybe it solves a problem for you, or you think it's going to be important for the industry at large?
Yes. And I will preface, I feel like I need to preface it by saying what I'm about to say in no way, shape, or form minimizes the difficult period we've gone through over the last 2 years. The tragedy of everything that many of us have had to deal with through the pandemic. It's been a very difficult time. A lot of people hurt, a lot of people lost. I know I've lost some people. So, and what I'm about to say does not take away from that in any way, shape, or form. But I truly believe that there is opportunity in everything. If there are silver linings to everything, if you're willing to see them. And I do believe that what makes me really excited about the time that we're in right now is that the whole world of L&D, the whole world of work, but specifically in the context of L&D, has been pushed outside of its comfort zones, has been forced to look at their work in a different way, has been challenged to do things differently, to do things better. And everybody is forced to be operating outside of their comfort zone the last 2 years. And the question is going to be, and this is where the exciting opportunity for you comes to me, what's going to happen next? Because there are going to be some people who they've stretched the rubber band out, and they're going to as soon as they can, they're going to let it go, and it's just going to snap back. Mm. There are going to be people that are going to have the rubber band stretched out and find ways to pin it there so that now their comfort zone is much, much bigger. And I think the majority of people are probably going to be in a place where there'll be some contraction, but the rubber band is going to be bigger than it was before. And the whole industry through that, the comfort zone is going to be bigger. The opportunities are going to be bigger. The possibilities are going to be bigger. We're already seeing that through the supplier community, that a lot of them, as we touched on earlier, are operating in spaces that they haven't operated in before, which has made the scope of their influence bigger. And I think that we're going to see that as on the practitioner level as well. You mentioned the instructional designers. The instructional designers' role has gotten bigger through the pandemic. The learning professionals' role has gotten bigger throughout the pandemic. And I think that there's a huge amount of opportunity in that. I'm in this field because I feel like the ability to help someone learn is transformative, can literally change the world, can change someone's life, can change someone's world, and can change the world in the process. And we have been stretched, and we have the opportunity to just, everything's gotten bigger. How can we leverage that to do more going forward? And it's an exciting time to be in L&D to leverage that.
David Kelly, you are the CEO of the Learning Guild. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, super fascinating, talking about trends in our industry, but also your own personal passions, which was really, really nice for you to share. I really appreciate that. If there's anything that you want to give a shout out to or anything for the Learning Guild, is there anything that anybody should check out, or, obviously DevLearn, but any particular thing that you'd like to give a shout out here at the end of the conversation?
Anybody who's watching who's not familiar with the Guild, just go to learningguild.com. Membership is completely free. All the publications and such that I mentioned, we share with our members free. You just have to log in. And again, it's completely free. I won't sell anything beyond that. All of our events and anything we do, you can check out on learningguild.com. But check it out, join as a free member, and check out all the resources we share with the community.
David, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day today. Really appreciate it. I hope that we get to catch up again sometime in the near future.
Sounds good. Thanks for inviting me.
Yep.